Hello, everybody. And hey, Nifty Ness. Welcome in. How are you doing? You guys, please go check out Nifty Ness. Hope everybody is doing well tonight. I apologize for canceling the stream last night. As I explained on Twitter and MySpace, it's an absolute nightmare getting Alone in the Dark New Nightmare to capture. And I don't know how I managed it last year and somehow accidentally removed the source. But yes, subsequent hours have yielded nothing, and I don't know if we're gonna stream that other play through the other character this year, because did I even want to in the first place? Did I even like the game that much last year? I don't know. I'm okay, thanks, Niftiness. It was a long day at work because the internet and phones were down, so we had to find workarounds. Because, yeah, we can't just cancel meetings and not do work because the internet and phones are down. Fortunately, my boss had a laptop and a phone with one of those hotspots, so at least able to get internet that way. But I promised I would do several bonus streams as we continue to turn this interesting 1920s horror novel into an audiobook during the course of Spooktober. I thought I might as well do one tonight. And then tomorrow, try to figure out what second game we're going to play this month. And thank you to everybody who came out to my last couple of streams. On Saturday, we played Halloween World and Invasion of the Halloween Fiends for short Spooktober Saturday. Both of them were very fun. Comic horror games. And before that, well, we've mostly been playing Resident Evil 3 on the GameCube ever since we finished our wonderful cinematic platformers for the year. But you don't need to hear me talk about how wonderful Flashback is. But tonight, we're going to continue Cold Harbor by Francis Brett Young. And as a reminder, I won't be responding to chat until I finish at the end of the stream. It'll only be 2 chapters. But this book has seriously long chapters. Like, some of them are like, 20 pages. Some of them are like, 50 pages. I'm like, were these appearing in magazines? Or did your editor just not be like, hey, bro, can you kind of even that out? Whatever editor said back in the 20s. Hey, we're in the 20s. How the hell did that happen? And so as such, to not disturb the audiobook, I've turned off raids and Streamlabs alerts. Yeah, I think that's everything important. I always mean to brew a glass of throat coat before I stream these things, and then I forget. Oh well. Making sure. This was where I stopped, right? I didn't get it wrong. Chapter 3. Dulston. Evelyn Wake stopped herself. For half an hour we had been carried along the drowsy current of her voice, and the silence that followed was like that which rouses the sleeping passenger when he hears, instead of the thud of engines, a lapping of harbor water. Just so, serenely, she brought us into port and left us to awaken in silence, surprised to think how far we had travelled in our sleep. In place of that cosy parlour of the Fox, itself a focus of light upon the dark contours of Midland hills, we now regained consciousness of the Italian night, the faint stars, the white, high-sailing moon that now shone almost vertically upon herself and her listeners. Nobody spoke. We all sat waiting quietly for Ronald to continue the story. He rose and walked to the parapet to knock out his pipe. "Curious," he said, "how extraordinarily innocuous it all sounds here. Of course, the stirring time is still to come." He turned to me directly. "To tell you the truth, we're rather looking to you to help us. Time after time since this business happened, we've thought of you. For when we began to look at the map, we saw that Cold Harbor wasn't 5 miles as the crow flies from your old home at Halesby. He's bound to know all about it, we said, and probably more than we do. That's one of the reasons why we've been keeping Mr. Furnivall's story hot for you. We felt that you'd be able to supply us with its opening chapter. Supposing we get that settled before I go on." "Of course you guessed quite rightly," I said. "I've known about Cold Harbor ever since I was a child, 30 years ago. In those days the house was empty. It hadn't been occupied for years. The Pomfret trustees couldn't let it." "Why couldn't the Pomfret trustees let Cold Harbor?" said Wake quickly. "Ghosts?" "No, I don't think it was anything of that kind," I told him. "I'm talking of the 90s. By that time the Pomfrets, our local aristocrats, had definitely gone under. As the girl at the Fox told you, an ironmaster named Walter Willis had bought their big house, Mon Hall. Cold Harbor, their dower house, was a bit too remote and old-fashioned and ramshackle for any of the other big businessmen to take a fancy to it. Since you've made the suggestion, I do seem to remember some sort of a ghost story, but nothing very definite. People in the Black Country were far too busy getting rich to bother about things of that kind. The other Pomfret mansion, Mon Hall, was always said to be haunted too, but that didn't prevent the Willises from keeping open house. The Pomfrets must have been rather a grisly family. But let's get back to Cold Harbor. I know, of course, that it is supposed to stand on the site of a Roman villa, but I don't think it had ever been excavated in my time. I thought it rather gruesome myself, because I was an imaginative child, and because it had stood for so long empty and neglected. But the curious thing is that though it was only 5 miles from Halesby, I never visited it. That's a remarkable thing in itself, for in all that country it must be the only corner that slipped me. And that's all I can tell you about it. But Furnivall, Humphrey Furnivall, is a different matter altogether. I haven't heard of him for years, so I can't even be sure it's the same man. How old do you make him?" "He has no age," Evelyn Wake murmured. "Anything between 50 and 68, said her husband. "Then I think it must be the same man. At any rate, 30 years ago he was in the prime of life. In those days he lived at Dulston, on the wrong side of what old Walter Willis used to call the green fringe of the Black Country. And first of all, by the way, I can satisfy your wife's curiosity about his acquaintance with Martock. No doubt some Midland corporation sent him down to investigate the lead lodes on Mendip. He was a mining engineer. No ordinary one either. I know that in those days he had an enormous professional reputation. It must have been enormous for a boy like myself to have heard of it. I can't tell you where he came from, or what his beginnings were, but certainly, at the time I'm speaking of, he had made for himself a name that was quite unique, helped, possibly, by his godfather and godmother, for the combination is one that you can't easily forget. I remember that it impressed me immediately when first I heard it, and knew nothing else about him. But let us get down to details. I think you may have heard me speak sometimes of an old friend, a Dr. Morehouse, a curious figure, again, a bachelor, and an enormous influence in my life. He was a professor, as you know, in the medical school at North Bromwich, but long before I took to doctoring, he had been forced to retire from that post by the smoke, which didn't agree with his lungs. When I remember him first, he was still carrying on his work in the town, escaping every weekend to a cottage that he had taken on the high ridge between Penbeacon and Uffdown. I've never, to this day, known a creature more human and erudite at the same time. A great man, if only his health could have carried him through. For some reason or other, I shouldn't wonder if my boundless admiration had something to do with it, he took a fancy to me. In holiday time, we used to go on long walks together over the hills, and come back tired to tea at his cottage. A great viewpoint. Time after time from his front door I've seen those great black country sunsets of the kind that so impress you, and later, when I cycled home to bed, I'd stop at a gate above Uffdown Wood and listen to the nightingales, watching, at the same time, great jets of flame leaping from the throats of the blast furnaces, and the serpentine fires of the pit mounds smouldering over Mon, my head buzzing, all the time, with the fascination of the things he'd told me. But that's a digression, and your story is more important. In those days, and for that matter, all through his life, my friend's chief interest was anthropology. I think that was partly why he chose that commanding prospect to live with, because it offered his imagination so wide a field to brood on, reconstructing the life of the people with bones he disinterred, and whose weapons he found upon the dome of Uffdown. And so, I supposed, he drifted into a loose association with Humphrey Furnivall, one of the few moneyed men in the district who understood him, appreciated his learning, and shared his enthusiasms. I still remember the first day on which I met him. It was Saturday, a half-holiday, and we'd planned to walk over and investigate some of the Arenig boulders at the other end of the range. It had taken my fancy, that idea of a vast glacier coiling like a slow snake out of Wales and depositing its alien stones on our own hills. Arenig. What a savage and romantic name. I burst into Morehouse's cottage, burning with eagerness, expecting to find him. On the hearth, astride, and warming his hands at the fire, stood an enormously tall gentleman in carefully creased cashmere trousers, black cutaway coat, and patent leather boots, fierce blue eyes staring at me under a tangle of red hair, like Highland cattle, you know, and a flaming beard beneath which, and this, I think, impressed me most, was a flowing satin bow of the kind that in those days was called artistic, and a shirt and collar of Wotan blue. He just stood there and grinned at me, and all the time he kept on bending and straightening his knees, as though he were performing some kind of physical exercise. He didn't speak a syllable until Morehouse came in. Then he nodded at me and said, "What is this, Morehouse?" And my friend told him who I was. That seemed to satisfy him, for afterwards he took no notice of me. "Really?" he said. "Ready?" he said, in a brusque, business-like way, and out they went together, with me trailing behind, not on any Arenig adventure, but straight up on to the top of Uffdown. I never felt more cheated or out of it in my life. Morehouse was too wrapped up in his visitor to take any notice of me, and this made me fiendishly jealous. They went at an enormous pace. I had to run to keep up with them, and all the time they were talking hard in their specialist's jargon that I couldn't understand, try as I might, the kind of elusive shorthand that experts use in the knowledge that no explanations are necessary. I can see them now, standing together on the dome of Uffdown, a bright, flowing day on the hilltop, a perfect flame of gorse, and all the border mountains as clear as if they'd been cut out of blue cardboard. I can see Morehouse with his slow, leisurely gait, and my supplanter, Furnivall, darting about from place to place like some strong-winged hawk, all fire and energy and hairy fierceness. He waved his arms and grinned and pointed, and at the end of each triumphant sentence came that laugh which froze the blood of your poor wife. Only I, as a child, shouldn't have called it sinister. It seemed to me just the expression of his triumphant energy, as if he were saying, "There you are! While you slow people go fuddling about with your theories, I can swoop and snatch the truth up from under your noses." It troubled me to see my idol treated with such a want of respect. Little by little, picking up here and there a word that I knew, I gathered that they were talking about some battle in early history, of which Ostorius Scapula and Caractacus were the heroes, and this gorsy hilltop the scene. Later, when they made me read Tacitus for an examination, it all came back to me. The object on which Furnivall expended his ghoulish energy was the probable site of the burial ground of this historic fight. Caractacus crossed the Severn at Wildwas. Ostorius, checked by the Uffdown reverse, followed slowly, Which way? Down there, by the Watling Street? In those days all the Severn basin was clogged with forest, only the greater hilltops, such as the Clees, lifting up like islands. The way Astoria Scapula went, he said, was straight along the causeway to Cold Harbour, and so due north through Dulston and Wolverbury, keeping to the high ground all the way, until he reached the road somewhere near Cannock. Huh? And he burst out laughing. Very well, he said. The Britons buried their dead under the mounds that you've dug. The Romans, being decent people, carried theirs from the field of battle to Cold Harbour, never excavated, mind you, and continued to shed their wounded as they died, all the way between there and Watling Street. Huh? He pulled out a map, and he and Morehouse lay together on the rabbit-bitten turf. This, he said, is the line of the Cold Harbour Road. Good. Produce that northwards to Watling Street. You see it keeps to the hilltops all the way. Now, there. He made a minute cross with a pencil whose fine point ravished me with envy. There, right on our line, mark you, is the site of the house that I'm building, and you may take it from me that the broken bones I've unearthed came from some poor devil who was wounded 1840 years ago, within 100 yards of the spot where we're lying. Huh? He swept the map off the turf, folded it, and hurried off downhill again. We followed. I can remember very few of the arguments that Morehouse advanced against his theory. I know he said that we weren't even certain that the battle had been fought on Uffdown. An unbroken tradition, Furnivall declared. Traditions were so unreliable. Tradition assigned every Celtic earthwork in England to the Romans. Furnivall wouldn't have it. Tradition was as valid as any historical evidence, not absolutely contemporary. He spoke with feeling of the Catholic Church. We had no evidence, Morehouse argued, that the Cold Harbour Road existed in those days. Admitted, said Furnivall, the soldiers of Ostorius probably planted a grove at the point where they buried their comrades. Colonia Arborum. No need for that, Morehouse replied, when you come to think that Cold Harbour was in the middle of what later became the great forest of Mercia. So we jogged down the hill, disputing, our progress punctuated by that hateful laugh of Furnivall's. He clung to his thesis like a bigot. No reasoned argument could move him. It surprised me to find Morehouse taking it with such good humour. If Furnivall had spoken to me, I know I should have been hostile to him. But he didn't. As far as he was concerned, I didn't exist. I disliked him even more when we came back to Morehouse's cottage for tea. He sat glaring at me, as I thought, across the fire, wolfing buttered toast piece after piece at an incredible rate. I'd never seen anyone eat so fast. I'd never seen anyone live so fast in every particular, gesture, speech, movement, thought. It was tiring to be in his company. When he'd finished eating, he sprang to his feet. "Glad of your opinion," he said, "and sorry we don't agree, but I shall convert you yet. You'll be able to see for yourself. When shall it be? I could have driven you over now, but the light won't last. What about tomorrow? Huh? Sunday?" I held my breath. I think I must have looked anxiously, reproachfully at Morehouse, and no doubt he saw me. He realized, kind soul that he was, that I'd been done out of my Arenig adventure, and didn't want to disappoint me for the morrow. "This young man and I," he began, "had planned—" I breathed again, but Furnivall swooped into the middle of his sentence. "Plans be damned," he said. "The best plan is to come over to Dulston. I want the matter settled. Come tomorrow morning. I'll send my trap over for you, if you like. You can bring the boy with you. Dinner at 1 sharp. We don't have lunch in Dulston. Now make up your mind. I shall expect you. Huh?" And off he swept into the lane, where a solemn coachman with a big black horse in a gig, all shining yellow, was prowling up and down as though they too were on wires and itching to be off at top speed. Furnivall leapt rather than walked towards them, sprang up into the box seat, and took the reins. "One moment! Your overcoat!" Morehouse called after him. "I never wear one." Was one, Furnival called back. He waved his whip and gave the horse the lash. The great brute shot forward like an arrow. I saw the coachman clutching at the rail of the seat as they swung round the corner on one wheel. "Well, well," said Morehouse, laughing to himself. "He's a passionate person. He must have driven 30 miles to find me. I hope he'll get home safely." Evidently he did, for the next morning at midday the black horse, mettlesome as ever, was champing in the lane, waiting to whirl us over to Dulston. I'm telling you all this in detail, because I don't want to interrupt your story again, because I want to give you everything I know about your hero, if that's what he is, with all the vividness that comes back to me out of a boyish memory. Off we drove, at an enormous pace, as it seemed to me, down through the woods and into the edge of the Black Country. We passed the gates of Maughan Hall, where you can still see the Pomfret Arms, and shot out along the valley of the Stour, which Willis's works have now turned into an abomination of desolation. Then we climbed the side of the ridge on which stood the gigantic headgear of Fatherless Bairn Colliery. In those days it wasn't called Fatherless Bairn. That was part of Furnival's story. There, a couple of 100 yards from the pit head, stood a brand-new house. Today you wouldn't think the house remarkable. Examples of that sort of architecture are scattered over every suburb in England. But 30 years ago, I may tell you, it was the very latest thing in revivals. Half-timbered gables, porches, fantastic chimney-pots, bow windows, a jumble of all incongruous styles that was supposed, in those days, to represent a return to the picturesque. Of course the appearance of such aspirations in the middle of the Black Country impressed me, and Mr. Furnival, who met us on the drive, was evidently proud and eager to demonstrate the mechanical contrivances with which it was fitted. He was dressed in the same clothes as those which had astonished me the day before, only, in place of the blue shirt-collar, his chest and throat were encased in the starched front, and a collar so high and rigid that he looked half-throttled by it. Above its brim, his face seemed more sanguine and potent than ever. His lanky body oozed energy like a steam-hammer. His mind leapt from point to point with an efficiency and exactness that made me feel dizzy. In 10 minutes we had explored the whole of the house, a miracle of convenience, and found ourselves on the edge of the gravel pit in which he had made his find. "But we will examine that after dinner," he said, and with that he looked at his watch, took a dog whistle out of his waistcoat pocket, and blew it shrilly. For the moment I couldn't imagine what this performance meant, until, all of a sudden, 3 children, 2 small pig-tailed girls and a boy several years younger than myself, came running up like dogs called to heel. "Gareth, Guinevere, and Elaine," he said by way of an introduction, to which they responded with timid smiles. I expect they've been playing croquet. Croquet on Sundays, huh? Does that shock you, Dr. Morehouse? No? I might have known it wouldn't. Ubi tres medici, ibi duo athei. But we're not atheists here, nor Protestants either. We keep to the faith of St. Augustine. When they've heard Mass, they have their liberty." He pulled out his watch again. The cover went back with a noiseless flick, mechanically perfect, like everything else in that house. The children stood by in silence. Then a brass gong thundered in the hall. "Dinner," he said, and led the way into the house. We'd been rushed through the building so violently, and entertained on the way by such a variety of mechanical devices, that I hadn't managed to take in anything else. Now we entered a room that was different from any I'd ever seen before. Its walls were draped to the height of a man, with tapestry hangings. Over the Norman arch of the stone fireplace hung what I can now recognize as a pre-Raphaelite triptych, representing 3 aureoled figures on the verge of seasickness. "Burne-Jones," said Mr. Furnival with a jerk of his finger, and Dr. Morehouse nodded and said, "Ah," with a respect that I couldn't understand. Then we sat down at a black oak table, myself between the 2 crushed little girls with the romantic names. A moment later 2 women entered. The first, a tall and rather attractive figure, with masses of coppery hair and a white skin, took her place opposite to Dr. Morehouse, at Mr. Furnival's left hand. The second and elder, a little woman with a pasty, patient face, dressed in a long jibbeh of dark blue satin, stole quietly to the other end of the table. Mr. Furnival, who was already carving beef with a gluttonous efficiency, hardly noticed the arrival of either. I suppose that both belonged to the category of our host suddenly looked up from his dish and glared at the last. "Jane," he said, "this is Dr. Morehouse. Dr. Morehouse, my wife." The woman smiled timidly. Mr. Furnival went on with his swiftly efficient carving. Even his knife was more perfect mechanically than any I'd ever seen, and from that moment I don't think he addressed another word to her. Dr. Morehouse tried to do so, but whenever he attempted it, Mr. Furnival broke in with an irritable interruption. By the looks with which he raked the table from time to time, you'd have thought he hated every one of us, and me particularly. Neither Mrs. Furnival nor the red-haired girl, whose name I now discovered to be Miss Penny, though whether it was her father's or merely an abbreviation for Penelope I couldn't guess, dared, apparently, to raise their voices above a whisper. The children didn't even open their mouths, and I was awed into following their example. But Mr. Furnival, between his enormously rapid mouthfuls, continued to elaborate the thesis that he'd already expounded on Updown. On the table at his right hand stood an enormous beaker of beer, from which he steadily filled and refilled his tumbler. By the end of the first course, he must surely have drunk a quart of it, with the result that his sanguine face grew redder and redder under the masses of fiery hair. Beyond this, he showed no sign of the volume of food and liquor that he was absorbing, and yet, as the meal went on, his body gave me more and more the idea of a high-pressure boiler, full of immense and increasing potential heat and energy enough to blow the roof off. It couldn't go on forever. By the time that second course arrived, these energies seemed to diffuse themselves into a blander mood. He stopped laying down the law about Roman Britain to Dr. Morehouse, and he began to take notice of the tall girl on his left. He sat back in his chair, breathing noisily and deeply, and glancing sideways at her from time to time. She herself appeared to be unconscious of this scrutiny, but I took it in, wondering what it meant. By this time, I must confess, the sense of his diminished concentration had made me less frightened to observe him. I watched closely. His left hand was lying on the table. Slowly, with a sort of impish deliberation, he moved it, so that it touched hers. Miss Penny gave a sudden start and snatched her hand away. I saw a tide of color rising under the milky skin of her neck. It swept into her cheeks, ears, forehead, until she was as red to the roots of her hair as Furnival himself. I imagined that nobody else had seen what happened, but I was wrong. Mrs. Furnival had also seen. I caught the glance that passed from her grey-greenish eyes halfway. On her pasty face was a smile that I couldn't interpret, as if she had been forced to condone a bad joke. Mr. Furnival's cackle broke the silence. He leaned over to Miss Penny and whispered something in her ear that made her look as if she'd like to hide herself under the table. So elated was he by this performance that he now leaned over to Morehouse and repeated what he had said in an undertone. I couldn't hear what he said, but Morehouse's face stiffened into a mixture of embarrassment and disgust, which told me that he had listened to something blatantly indecent. And again Mr. Furnival laughed. With dessert appeared a cut-glass decanter of port. By this time Mr. Furnival seemed in the best of humours. He walked, or rather darted, around the table, filling the wine-glasses, including those of the children and my own. They seemed to take it as a matter of course. For me, this was the first time I had ever tasted wine, and that, I think, is one of the reasons why I remember this dinner party with such extraordinary clearness. Miss Penny was the only one of us who refused it, and this gave Mr. Furnival the occasion to whisper something that set her fiercely blushing again. "Well, if you can't take your liquor like a man," he said aloud, "you'd better go and fetch Gawain." "Well, if you can't take your liquor like a man," he said aloud, "you'd better go and fetch Gowan." The wine was sweet and insidious. It made me think that this was rather a jolly adventure after all. The strangeness of that room and that commanding figure at the head of the table no longer frightened me. "Who's Gowan?" I heard myself saying, but nobody answered me, and a moment later the blushing Miss Penny returned with a podgy infant of 2, which Mr. Furnival, embracing a new opportunity of contact, took from her arms. He settled the sleepy child on his knee, then dipped his forefinger into the glass of port and moistened its lips. The baby put out its tongue and licked them like a kitten. "You see he likes it," laughed Mr. Furnival, and I, by this time sleepy and complacent, watched him as he went on dipping his finger into the wine and giving it to the baby to suck. No doubt it was a painful and disgusting sight. I could see by my friend's cold face that he disliked it, but I, in my growing benevolence, and Mr. Furnival, considered it the greatest fun in the world. The baby went on sucking at his venous fingers greedily. The other children lost their timidity and began to snigger. Miss Penny sat still in purgatory, and on Mrs. Furnival's pasty face was fixed the same set smile. Time passed now without any clear impression. In a blurred vision I can remember the baby's head lolling over, Mr. Furnival thrusting him, with a laugh of satisfaction, into Miss Penny's arms, myself rising to my feet, my brain spinning round like a paper windmill, and following an airy track in the wake of Morehouse into another room smelling of tobacco, where a divan, heaped with cushions, restored my equilibrium. I was drunk and cross and awfully sleepy. Out of the confusion I heard Dr. Morehouse's voice. "You'd better lie down and go to sleep." I felt him tucking the cushions round my legs. I suppose I lay there for a couple of hours, sometimes sleeping, sometimes hazily aware of a murmur of voices, or stabbed half awake by the sound of Mr. Furnival's laugh. Out of their murmurous talk emerged strange words that then meant nothing to me, but stuck in my mind as meaningless symbols to bring back the whole atmosphere of that adventure when I encountered them later in print. Terra sigillata, hippocasti. It is curious. Even now the repetition of those 2 words can send a flare back into that lost chamber of my brain like a lit fuse. Of course, they were still talking about Roman Britain, and while I slept, no doubt, they visited Mr. Furnival's latest excavation. But I knew nothing of this, nor did I ever see Mrs. Furnival again, Miss Penny, or the children. Never in my life. When Dr. Morehouse came to wake me, the sun had gone down. My head was splitting. Sometimes I wonder if, after all, it was only one glass. Through the cold evening Morehouse drove back to Uffdown, dropping me at Halesby on the way. I went straight to bed, and heard him talking on the landing to my father. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'd no idea it would have upset him like that. This man, Furnival, is a queer customer. Yes, curiously dynamic. I don't think there's a more striking personality in the Midlands." It was a queer incident, wasn't it? You, of course, will look at it from another point of view and in the light of your own experience. From that day until one rainy afternoon many years later, when I was a medical student, and Morehouse, dear fellow, had died with his work unfinished, I don't think Mr. Furnival ever came into my mind. Of course, I knew that he was a prominent figure in the neighborhood. His name was often in the papers as that of a pillar among the community who called themselves Anglo-Catholics, and were called Romanizers by the other people. I knew also that he was on the council of the North Bromwich University, and was counted something of an expert in education. Once, I think, I saw him driving furiously in one of those new perils to bicycles called motor cars, but I don't think I ever heard of him in a way that arrested my attention until one day when, coming out from hospital to Halesby, I found myself forced into a first-class smoker. My companions in the compartment were 2 black country businessmen who had spent the day on 'change in North Bromwich. Their talk was of personalities rather than of prices, and neither would have distracted me from the anatomical textbook that I was reading, if one of them hadn't said of a sudden, "Well, I suppose that's the end of Furnival." I pricked up my ears and listened. "I don't know about that," said the other. "If you want my opinion, I think Furnival's not only the best mining engineer, but the biggest brain we've got in the Midlands today." "He'll never live this down," said the first. "Old Joseph Hingston himself was at the board meeting. I've had it at first hand from him." He leaned over and went on talking behind his hand in a throaty whisper that was perfectly audible to me in my corner. Little by little I picked up the thread of the story. Furnival, it seems, had become consulting engineer to a new colliery called the Sedgebury Main, which, until the time of his appointment, had hardly paid its way. I knew the place well, for its headgear, topping the long ridge above Dulston, had lately become one of the landmarks of the neighbourhood. With his usual tremendous energy, Furnival had taken the show in hand, preparing a scheme of financial and mechanical reconstruction that took the directors of the moribund company off their feet and into his pockets, as the saying is. "Old Hingston," said the man in the corner, "says he had them properly hypnotized. The man's brain is uncanny, that's what he says." So hypnotized, I gathered, that within a month of getting his appointment, Furnival had scrapped the whole of the colliery's original plan and convinced the board that he was going to make it the best thing of the kind in Staffordshire. In another 6 weeks he persuaded them to raise $250,000 of new capital to finance his developments, and so restored confidence in the undertaking that he'd quadrupled the market value of their shares. Nearly the whole of the new capital went on orders for improved machinery from America. Furnival promised them, and convinced them, that in 3 years this massive expenditure would be covered. There wasn't a flaw in his plans. The board just swallowed them whole. I don't blame them either, from what I hear, but when it came to asking for new capital within 6 months, well, that was a bit thick, I admit. And yet the beggar carried them again. Personal magnetism, that's what I call it, said the man in the corner. I suppose he was right. I suppose, also, that the obedient directors were justified. Certainly, Furnival had fulfilled the first part of his promise. In all the Midlands there was no mining undertaking that inspired such confidence in its skill and mechanical efficiency. Within 9 months of Furnival's appointment, the Sedgebury Main started on its new career with the benedictions of all the biggest capitalists in the neighbourhood. Nobody was more assured of its success than Furnival himself. Into it he had put the last ounce of his extraordinary brain. It was his masterpiece, and he knew it. A masterpiece in practice as well as on paper. The first 5 months' working fulfilled every promise that he'd made. And then, at the end of the 6th, came the water, not slowly, insidiously, but in a savage flood that swamped the mine in a single night, and with it 47 human lives. It was a disaster in which there was no question of escape or rescue. I remember reading the bulletin in the Courier. In half an hour all was over with the Sedgebury Main, and the $500,000 of money that had been put into it. The only person who took it calmly was Furnival. Nothing less than a disaster of this size sufficed to show his strength. For 10 days and nights he concentrated on a scheme of salvage, as sweeping in its strength and confidence as the original plan. The directors met to consider it. For 5 hours on end he bullied them over it, but they'd had enough, and even Furnival couldn't bend them. This was the meeting about which the fellow in the corner whispered behind his hand. Furnival actually had the nerve, he said, to ask for another 100,000, as cool if it were 2 halfpenny. Of course, with the shares where they are, they couldn't touch it, but that didn't stop him. "Look here," he says, and mind you, I've got the very words from old Hingston's lips. "Look here, if you haven't the pluck to go to the public for the money, I'll put down 50,000 myself." Like that. But they wouldn't have it, and I'm not sure if they weren't right. I think I should have acted the same. That pit's got a bad name, and even if they pump it dry, it's a name that'll take some living down before they'll be able to get men underground with any confidence. It's the women that put them off it, you know. But I must finish about that meeting. When Furnival had made his proposal, old Hingston, who was chairman, asked him to leave the room while the board discussed it, and out he went. Well, as far as I can gather, there wasn't any discussion in the true sense of the word. There wasn't a man there that hadn't had his bellyful of the Sedgebury Main. Old Hingston saw which way it was going, so young George got up, and I proposed that they should realize that what they could on the plant and reserves, and then close down. Carried nem. Con. Then they sent out for Furnival. He came in, Hingston says, as if he were certain he'd done the trick. "Take a seat, Mr. Furnival," said old Hingston, but he said he preferred to stand. "The board has considered your proposal, Mr. Furnival," he says, "and decided unanimously that it shall not be accepted. We're not going to throw good money after bad. There's nothing left for us to do but to close down permanently." Of course, they were all wondering how Furnival would take it. Well, he stood there for a second as if he hadn't heard. Then he went down like a stone. They thought it had killed him, but it hadn't. 5 minutes later he was sitting up again. "I'm sorry this has happened," said old Hingston kindly. I'm sorry you're such a lot of damned cowards," says Furnival. "You haven't the guts of a louse between you. I'm finished with mining," he says. So he got to his feet, he wouldn't let them help him, and ran out of the room like a lunatic. Left his hat behind him as a souvenir. Yes, you may bet your shirt that's the last of Furnival. The train pulled up at the junction, and I left them shaking their heads over it. You can see the headgear of the Sedgebury Main to this day. They call it Fatherless Bairn. You must have noticed it, by the way, from Cold Harbour. And as for Mr. Furnival, evidently the man in the corner was wrong. It wasn't the end of him. Chapter 4. En Door. "No, it wasn't the end of him," Ronald Wake repeated as soon as I finished. "It wasn't the end of him by a long way. But what you've told us, what we've been waiting for you to tell us, for in this case we've been driven to a good deal of speculation because of its delicacy, has been extraordinarily useful in filling in the background of the picture of what Mr. Furnival's end was, or rather of what it will be if he fulfills our expectations. It's curious how this detached portrait of our host as a young man throws light on his later reactions. If we had improvised one, arguing backward to fit our own conclusions, I think our picture would have shown a general resemblance to yours, without, of course, the inspiration of its details, the gesture toward Miss Penny, the baby sucking port, the moment at the board meeting when he went down like a stone. Incidents of that kind are beyond the reach of invention. And I'm glad, in a way," he went on, "that you never actually explored Cold Harbour, because it would have deprived me of the pleasure of describing it. Of course, you never went there, just for the simple reason that on the plane of practical geography it doesn't exist. I was there a fortnight ago, and yet tonight, I assure you, I find it difficult to persuade myself that it had a more real existence than one of those landscapes that repeat themselves in dreams, countries of which the details, when you revisit them, are almost piercingly familiar, but which you recognize as phantasmal and peopled only by phantoms. Physically, as you know, the Cold Harbour district is a strip of sloping country between the main road that runs from the Severn to North Bromwich and the edge of the Black Country. From the south it is isolated by hills along the base of which straggles a remnant of the Mercian forest, now a preserve for pheasants. No road enters it from that side but the half-hearted cart track by which we reached the Fox. On the north it is bounded not by Black Country, this is the point, but by a zone that was black 100 years ago, riddled with colliery workings, scattered with pit mounds, utterly useless for farming or afforestation, abandoned, dead. You can see what I mean if you imagine it as a kind of no-man's land, an area wrecked and untenable between the armies of black and green, a possession so long disputed and so unprofitable that both sides have abandoned it. The Black Army has retreated, like a tide settling down into the Staffordshire colliery basin, and the Green, with a weakened purpose, has timidly re-established itself on the borders of the war-scarred area, as witness the minute oasis of the Fox, and Mr. Moseley's farm, from which the labourers came in to drink their evening pint. We slept extraordinarily well. That wasn't surprising when you consider the variety of adventure we'd achieved in the last 12 hours. Alma gave us an excellent breakfast, and after that we went out into the yard and gave the car a good oiling to prepare her for a forced run in the evening. The morning was brilliantly clear, with a dew that seemed to have washed the sky clean of all suspended grime, draining it away into the sump of low-drying land beneath us. The hedgerows and coppices around the Fox were bright with purple elder bushes, and busy with small packs of linnets and goldfinches pillaging their black fruit. While we fiddled about with the car, a robin came and sang on the red brick wall. It was like spring. Better than spring, in my own opinion. I don't think I've ever seen more blackberries or on the brambles in my life. We could have picked them by the quart, but nobody seemed to want them. There was nobody to want them. As I've told you already, that patch of the country only exists on maps. And I, of course, was too busy with my oily job to think of anything else. With Evelyn, who hates oil like poison, it was different. She hung about the yard, looking shriveled with cold, although the sun was shining. I told her to go and pick blackberries, but she wouldn't. "I don't want to leave you," she said. The curiousness of the mood that had fallen on her was so definite that I ended by asking her what was the matter. "Nothing," she said. "It's really nothing. I don't think I like this place," she said when I pressed her. Of course I thought that was just rubbish, so when I'd finished with the car we went for a sharp walk together. It was still a gem of a morning, one of those days when your mind turns naturally to the idea of cubbing, leaves still on the trees, but the smell of them in the air when you stand waiting at the covert side, with your ears strained to catch a whimper in the wood. And those woods, by the way, must be stiff with foxes, especially since our friend Furnival had quarrelled with the hunt. No wire, either. I suppose poor Mr. Moseley can't afford it. We went for a smart walk towards the east, where a cart track suggested that the farm should lie. It took us into another dip, with a sandy stream at the bottom, and straggling hazels so thick round us that we might have been miles away from anywhere. As for North Bromwich! But really the secrecy and silence of that hollow were quite incredible, and still, try as I would, I couldn't get Eve to talk. "Surely there's nothing wrong with this," I said. She shook her head. No, there was nothing wrong with it, but she didn't like it. "Well, my dear child," I said, "if it's as bad as that, there's no earthly reason why we shouldn't cut our appointment from this afternoon. After all, I gather you left it open. All we need do is leave a polite note with Mrs. Higgins and say we couldn't manage it. Suppose we go right back to the Fox and slip away at once." At this she became angry. "If we went now," she said, we'd have wasted the whole morning for nothing. Besides, she wanted to see the Martock manuscripts, and she wasn't going to allow me to miss the chance of seeing Cold Harbour. "It's no use worrying me," she said, quite kindly, I'll admit. "I can't help feeling queer, can I? And if we leave it at that, it'll be much better for everyone. Besides which, I've told Alma to prepare some lunch, and we'd have to pay for that in any case." This set me laughing, for if there's one thing typical in Evelyn's constitution, it's her anxiety to get her money's worth. She saw the joke herself, so it didn't matter. And at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, or just after, we'd set out together for Cold Harbour. A matter of 10 minutes. Follow the road and you can't miss it, Alma told us. She stood in the doorway of the Fox, watching us as we went, watching us out of sight. By this time the day had changed in a manner characteristic of the Black Country. I have told you already how in the early morning we got the impression that the sky had been washed by dew, and all its impurities drained downward into the lower levels of the coal measures. One reason for this clearness was that the day before had been Sunday, and 90% of the smokestacks were at rest. But all morning the chimneys of Dalston and Wolverbury and Darsall and all the other congeries of red brick with uncouth names had been disgorging their fumes of unconsumed carbon and sprays of steam until a greyish-yellow cloud hung over them. There wasn't a breath of wind that day. If it had been left to itself, the stuff would just have settled down on them like soup. But all the time fresh filth went on bubbling up from the bottom, so that the basin gradually filled, with the result that by midday its skimmings had reached the level of our sky. You couldn't see them, and yet they took every bit of colour out of the landscape, just as though we were looking through smoked glass. They were like a poison in our lungs. They made the air we breathed seem flat, devitalized, warm. We could taste their faint acridity with our tongues. All the time this thin, invisible poison came creeping up the slope of the hill. Evelyn spoke of it as a fog. We Londoners know the meaning of an honest fog, but this wasn't a fog, it was a blight. So we walked on through a landscape that was like a spoiled photographic plate. We followed the line of the Roman causeway between banks of rusty hazel. The surface of the road had been repaired by a dressing of slag that gave it a feeling of black sterility. The fields that we saw on either side of it, wherever the hedges struggled into gaps, had no greenness in them. They were dotted with mounds of ashes, on which no weeds would grow, and pits of dirty water. No trees but an occasional black and twisted hawthorn. In one field a huge circular boiler of a type that has long since been discarded lay on its side like a stranded buoy. No man's land with a vengeance. And then, suddenly, Cold Harbour. Although we were prepared for it, it took our breath away. There were only 3 buildings, the church, with the manor house and the parsonage on either side of it. They stood huddled together, as if for protection, on the brow of the hill, which fell away from them into the basin beneath, and about them, as though to perpetuate the reason of the hamlet's name, ran a belt of magnificent beeches. All through the Cotswolds, on our drive westward, the beeches had shone like pyramids of flame. On those that surrounded Cold Harbour, not 3 days later, there was not a leaf left. The beeches in Cotswold had trunks that showed a sheen of steel and platinum. The trunks of the Cold Harbour beeches were black and dull as soot. They stood up stark naked and motionless, as though they were dead, a complete circle, dipping over the brim of the ridge like a fairy ring, and as we passed within their circumference, it seemed as though we were stepping out of this life and into another of ghostly silence. A fancy, of course. As a matter of fact, the deep felting of beech mast and leaf mounds muffled our footfalls. First we passed the vicarage, a small house with pointed gables built of the local red bricks picked out with blue. The shrubberies on either side of the front gate were so overgrown that we couldn't see the lower story, but the upper windows were blocked by broken shutters. We judged that it was uninhabited. Then, within the boundary of a low stone wall, we passed the church, and that alone would have repaid us for our visit. As far as I could judge in passing, the tower at its western end was Saxon or early Norman, and unusually massive for the period. The little graveyard was carefully mown and tended, and so full that it had evidently served, at some time, for a large population. It ended abruptly against a high brick wall overtopped by the shrubberies of the manor house and the gable of its westernmost wing. We had to skirt this wall in order to reach Mr. Furnival's drive-gate, or rather the place where the drive-gate should have been, for now there was nothing but a gap between 2 shapely stone pillars carved with the Pomfret bearings. And here our progress seemed quieter than ever, for the drive ran under a tunnel of horse-chestnut trees, which must have been very gay in spring, and the drift of their leaves was thick under our feet. One moment. In my hurry to reach the house, I'm afraid I've forgotten something. At the level of the drive's opening, the causeway, which we'd now followed all the way from the main road past the Fox, came to an end with a high holly hedge so dense that we couldn't see beyond it. It seems a small thing to notice, but it finished so definitely, without even the continuation of a footpath, that we were conscious of being in the very bottom of a cul-de-sac, without any chance of escape, except along the narrow entrance of the Roman road, and, at that moment, I, at any rate, was aware of a sense of constriction, as though something unpleasant were crowding in on me, and I felt the need of space. However, that's by the way. The horse-chestnuts weren't quite as bare as the beeches. I suppose the beeches, being higher, protected them from wind. As we walked along beneath them, their yellow fans came floating down into our faces, and sometimes, without any movement to detach them, the seed cases fell with a heavy plop. We were awfully sensible there of the year's death. That place seemed 2 months later than the rest of the country. I suppose the trees had to fight against the blight of that poisonous air as well as time. The drive was a short one, a matter of 40 yards at the most. As we came out of its tunnel, we found ourselves flanking the front of the house. Nobody could see us there, so we halted to look at it. And really it was very beautiful. I can't tell you why. Probably it was nothing but the silence, the isolation, the unsuspectedness of the whole thing that gave it that effect. Architecturally, its front certainly wasn't beautiful in the least. It hadn't, I mean, the advantage of being constructed in one style, like the Cotswold houses that we'd just seen. To be exact, it was a mixture of two. The wing nearest us was half-timbered, with the bricks unwhitened. Its level was sunk a little below that of the rest of the house, so that its long horizontal windows reached to within a little distance of the ground, and the single doorway, with its sandstone arch of late perpendicular, was made to look squat by the fact that one entered it with a downward step. The rest of the building was modern. A Palladian entrance porch flanked on either side by high windows with slender mullions. You see, it had no uniformity of style, but what it had was a uniformity of material. Apart from the porch, the mass of the building was constructed of small red bricks, whose clay might have come from the same clay pit and taken shape in the same molds. What was more, they all seemed to be uniformly weathered, not, I suppose, by time, but by the acrid fumes that had pickled them ever since the black country was black. When we came closer, I almost said crept, for there really was something stealthy in our advance, I noticed, with the peculiar thrill that recognition gives one, that into the lower course of the timbered wall a number of bricks where another shape had been built, and, what was more, built with a diagonal pattern. I saw thousands of their fellows only yesterday, in those great aqueducts that go stalking over the Campagna. They were Roman bricks, laid in the Roman fashion. It was just as if a fragment of the villa's original wall had been built into the new house en bloc, and these, too, had weathered to the color of the rest. We kept the path close to the front of the building and approached the porch. The last of the Tudor windows reached just below the level of our shoulders. Its panes were latticed. Some had the purplish sheen of 18th century glass, some were of world bottle glass, dense and sea green, but all were so imperfect and aged as to distort by their uncertain refractions, and the little genre picture that we caught through them in passing had no need of distortion. It was that of a woman skinning a rabbit. She had brought it to the table under the window, I suppose, because that was the only part of her kitchen, or pantry, or whatever it was, that wasn't dark at that time of year. She didn't hear us approaching. Thick leaves had drifted with wind over what I think was a flagged pavement skirting the house. She didn't hear us. She may have been deaf, too, but she did become aware of our passing shadow, and that, when it fell on her, made her jump backward from her as unpleasant job as if she'd been shot. In this moment I got a quick impression of her face. The twisted glass may have been responsible for an illusion. It seemed to have the elongated distortion of an El Greco, greenish in color, the glass again, and horse-like, with prominent teeth and eyes. I was glad that Evelyn missed it, for it was the sort of face one might dream about. Yes, it was definitely not a modern face. It had the grotesqueness of the Middle Ages, like the Lincoln gargoyles. I rather hoped, for Evelyn's sake, that she wouldn't open the door for us. It would be a bad beginning. Luckily she didn't, and Eve, to my astonishment, seemed less sensitive than myself to the peculiar quality, I shall have to leave it at that, which oozed out of the house's facade. We entered the porch and rang the bell. The wire scraped loosely, as if it were disconnected. We waited for 2 whole minutes of intense silence. Then the door opened cautiously, smoothly, like that of an hydraulic safe. The person who opened it stood behind it. For an instant it seemed as if it had opened of itself. By this time nothing would have surprised me. But in the next the opening agent revealed herself in the shape of an elderly woman, whom Evelyn can describe much better than I can. He paused, and with the smoothness of a competitor in a relay race, his wife picked up the thread of the story. "A tiny woman of 50, she said, in a black satin dress, at least 10 years behind the fashion, but very neat, fastened high at the throat with a cameo brooch. She wore a white muslin apron and a long gold chain round her neck, with an emerald crucifix at the end of it that must have cost a fortune. Her hair was half grey, the indeterminate sort of grey hair that had once been fair. It was parted in the middle, and swept back tightly on either side above a very narrow forehead, so narrow that her head seemed to taper like an egg the wrong way up. What made it look even more like that was the fact that her eyebrows were thin and sandy, almost the same color as the rest of her face. She had a flattish, good-natured nose, and the sort of mouth of which you'd say at once that it showed a sweet, good, rather timid disposition. Her eyes were of a shade that's neither blue nor green nor hazel, a kind of muddy, neutral mixture of all three. What struck me about them was their dreadfully puzzled expression. They weren't frightened eyes, although they were timid. They looked you full and honestly in the face, but all the time they gave you the impression that the brain behind the narrow forehead was puzzled to distraction, that it couldn't possibly grasp the kind of life it had to deal with, or express the thoughts that arose in it. That made me most awfully sorry for her, anxious to explain her difficulties, whatever they might be, and to soften her loneliness. I was certain that she was lonely. She stopped, and after a moment Ronald Wake continued. Well, there we were. For a second we just stood staring at each other. Then she spoke as dispassionately as if the words had no meaning for her. "Good afternoon," she said. "I suppose you are the lady and gentleman that Mr. Furnival's expecting. Will you please step inside? I'll go and see if he's in his study." She said something else, but her voice was so quiet and bemused that we lost it as she retreated and left us standing on the threshold. Then we had time to look at the hall. It was square and patterned with oak beams and plaster. I'd guessed, as I've told you, that this part of the house was modern, but the rough staircase up which she went was certainly earlier. Tudor, I should say. The furniture was all old and good, 4 or 5 chairs and a long coffer, on which stood a row of brass candlesticks ready for the evening, all beautifully polished. Up to a height of 6 feet or so the walls were hung with faded Italian tapestries, the very ones, possibly, that you saw in the dining-room at Dulston 30 years ago, and the whole place was full of the smoky light that reached it from that veiled sky of which we'd already spoken. It was so extraordinary. I saw that Evelyn's face was quite flushed. "Well, what do you make of it?" I whispered. "It's quite beautiful, isn't it?" she said. "Could you live in it?" I asked her. She hesitated for a moment, and I hung on her hesitation. "Well," she said at last, "I think it could be made quite comfortable." "Do you?" I said. "You see, I put that question as a test, and I'll tell you why. This, mark you, is the plain, literal truth. From the moment I passed the threshold of Cold Harbour, the very instant, my skin had turned into goose flesh from head to toe. Even when I speak of it now, in cold blood and thousands of miles away, that sensation comes back to me. It wasn't cold in the ordinary sense, but I felt little shivering ripples rushing up from my feet, along my spine, over my cheeks, like the discharge of an electric current. I can't explain it. I never felt it before, and I've never felt it since, except in thinking or speaking of this story. And I could no more stop it then or now than... Wake paused and shrugged his shoulders inside his overcoat. Then he gave a laugh and continued. Evidently, there was something about the house that reacted curiously on my nerves. I tried to get over it by turning my back on the staircase and looking out into the drive. A long strip of lawn, ending in a rose pergola, ran down toward the wall and the road, but these you couldn't see, for all the further end was a black shrubbery of hollies and old yews. The lawn was smooth and carefully tended. On either side of it lay wide herbaceous borders, hazed with the milky hues of Michaelmas daisies in clumps, and brightened, if I can use that word, by dark-flowered dahlias. But there I found no relief. An autumn garden has a sadness when the sun is not shining, and here it seemed as if that blight in the sky had effaced every colour that disputed it. And beyond all, like sentinels set around a prison, the black, stark beeches kept watch, guarding the sadness within their circle from all influence of the outer world, where things were sweet and sane and shared in the illusion of life. And a silence. No robins here, I thought. They wouldn't have the heart to sing. The only mitigation to my hopelessness was the fact that Evelyn evidently didn't share it. I'm still puzzled to imagine why. The woman, whom I'd taken to be some kind of housekeeper, Alma had told us, you'll remember, that Mrs. Furnival was an invalid, came downstairs again. She had an elegant, brilliant buckle on her black satin shoes. Her face looked like a plaster mask against the darkness of her clothes, and of that sombre background she seemed as worried and preoccupied as ever. "I've told Mr. Furnival," she said. "Will you come upstairs into the library?" We followed her to the first floor, and turned into a room that occupied the front of the further wing. Its latticed windows commanded the length of the garden, the high skyline of beeches, and showed us the last kind of interior you'd have expected in such a remote place. That sounds like a contradiction. I know that Cold Harbour is only 12 miles from North Bromwich, with its million-odd inhabitants. What I've tried to imply is that the place seemed to have a spiritual isolation of its own. That road, those circling beaches. I won't enlarge on it. You must just take it from me or leave it. We'll get back to the room. Obviously, to begin with, it was in the taste of a man of culture. There was nothing in it that wasn't beautiful. A man of erudition, I might almost have said, for the furnishing had been chosen by an eye that was skilled in the details of the period it suggested, and sensitive to incongruities. It was the room, to put it shortly, of a man learned in the Middle Ages, one in which the face of the woman I'd seen through the kitchen window might have taken its place without offence. Perhaps Mr. Furnival had chosen her for the job with a sense of appropriateness. My eyes, you know my weakness, went at once to the bookshelves. Mr. Furnival's interests covered a wide field, and yet, even in that first moment, it was easy to recognize their general direction. Fine printing and binding evidently delighted him. Then I remembered the tapestry downstairs, the skilfully selected furniture. This man, I thought, is what you might call a medievalist. My eyes began to examine the other shelves in search of confirmation, when I suddenly realized that my eagerness had made me impolite to the woman in black satin, on whom I'd abruptly turned my back. I slewed around with an apology on my lips, but she had gone. Nobody there but Evelyn. "Isn't it stiflingly hot?" she said, and I was just wondering whether it would be fair to tell her of my own uncomfortable condition when Mr. Furnival entered. You'll remember that when I asked Eve to tell me what he looked like the night before, she couldn't do it. It had struck me as funny at the time, but now it seemed more curious than ever, for Mr. Furnivall wasn't the kind of figure you could easily forget. He came into the room briskly. He carried with him the quality that you noticed in his Dalston days, an aura of intense physical and spiritual energy. I was conscious, I mean, of a compelling personality to which his appearance didn't contribute. At Dalston, 20 years before, you speak of masses of red hair low down on the brows like the fringe of a Highland steer, and a tempestuous beard. You gave me the impression of a caricature of Bernard Shaw. I shouldn't wonder if the master's example had something to do with it. At the back of his head the hair was still there, a fringe of unruly white, but the brow and scalp as far backwards as the crown were now completely bald, and his forehead, which you never saw, now showed itself in a high benevolent dome, rising smooth above bushy eyebrows. The eyes themselves were deep-set, small and very blue. His chin was pointed and clean-shaven. His moustache straggled downward. He had a set of white, ill-fitting dentures, but you only saw them when his lip and moustache twitched upward in that characteristic laugh, and indeed the huge, smooth forehead was so conspicuous that I could scarcely look at anything else. Now for his clothes. Black patent leather boots, to begin with, then grey, home-knitted stockings and greenish knickerbockers. The boots came so high on his legs, and the knickerbockers so low, as to exaggerate the bulk and elongation of his figure. Then a black coat, green with age and very greasy, with a ready-made tie and 2-inch standing collar, fringed and dirty, showing the stud behind. But when he spoke, as he did, in a cultured voice, these unsavory personal details didn't seem to count. It was only when I compelled myself to look at him, at his cold blue eyes, his false teeth, and above all his hands, long and apparently sensitive, but with bitten fingernails, that I escaped the spell of the voice's persuasiveness. In the dark, I am prepared to believe that I should have found him charming. In that dim and lovely room, there were moments when his voice had its way with me. And not only the voice, for here, as you suggested, was a man of vast erudition, a lively, exciting mind, and, as far as we were concerned, a nature hospitable and benevolent. I felt, in fact, rather ashamed of the gusts of dislike that passed through my mind as involuntarily as the shivers that still went on wrinkling my skin. There was no reason, it seemed, for either, and yet their existence made me sympathize with the disquietude that had troubled poor Evelyn the night before. He came into the room, as I say, carrying with him that aura of energy. The little shrunken woman crept in quietly behind him. He took my hand with a firm grip. "Dr. Wake," he said, "pleased to make your acquaintance. Mrs. Wake and I have met already." He laughed for the first time. I agree with Evelyn. The laugh was unpleasant. "I'm sorry to have kept you," he went on. "I was in my study, and my wife couldn't find me." The woman behind him gave a faint smile. Evidently it was she that he referred to. She passed us and began to speak in whispers to Evelyn. He stood in front of me, sturdy, sanguine, smiling, examining me with his keen, elusive eyes. The silence was unpleasant. "It was kind of you to ask us," I said, though I had no idea how much we should have been missing if we hadn't come. "Not at all, not at all," he said. "You must give me credit for knowing that you'd appreciate Cold Harbour. It isn't often that such people as yourselves come near us. I sit here like a spider, and when they come I'm on to them. Huh? We're very lonely here. My wife is an invalid," he spoke the words almost with satisfaction, "and I am not on friendly terms with the people of our own station in the neighbourhood. I have no use for them, and they have no use for me, with their motor cars and their damned ostentation. Overfed, ignorant, bursting with money. Huh?" He went white as he spoke. The laugh with which he ended his sentence was full of hatred. I felt as though he'd made an uncomfortable enemy. "Well, money has its uses," I said. Contents of Cold Harbour, for instance, and the house itself. You're a lucky man to have found a place like this, and the place, if I may say so, is lucky to have found a master who appreciates the spirit of it." The compliment made him smile. You could see the pride and pleasure burning in him like a red coal. "I flatter myself that you're right," he said. "There's nothing like it in the Midlands. It's unique. I know it, and I'm devoted to it. It's a combination of everything that I want. Beauty, isolation, leisure. Unfortunately, Mrs. Furnivall doesn't agree with me. Huh?" When she heard her name, the little thing in black satin gave a jump and looked anxiously toward us, but Furnivall offered no explanation, and she caught nothing but his laugh. "We'd better go into the garden while it's light," he said. "Come along." He pulled a check cap on his head. Now that his baldness was hidden, you might have taken him for a man of 50. He went downstairs, talking rapidly all the time. The woman followed us. I pointed to the tapestries in the hall we passed through. "Florence," he said. "Yes, Eugene Muntz liked them. Perhaps you've read his books? I knew him well. In those days I knew everybody. Now I know nobody personally, though I manage to keep pretty well abreast of the times." We passed into the garden. Really, it was a relief. I can't exactly explain why. To feel the unpleasant pressure of that low roof no longer on top of me. I looked behind to see what was happening to Evelyn. She and Mrs. Furnivall were descending side by side in silence. Furnivall caught my glance. "They're all right," he said. "Trust the women to chatter, ha!" But even the garden was melancholy. On the grass our footsteps made no sound. The quiet, black shrubberies pressed in upon us. Beyond them the circle of beeches stood on guard. Do you know what a ghost hedge is? The Romans planted them round certain tombs to keep evil spirits from wandering out into the world again. The idea of a ghost hedge came into my mind when we stood in the middle of Mr. Furnivall's lawn with the black beeches around us. It seemed to me that there was reason for one. That atmosphere within that hedge was curiously, definitely evil. I've got to a point, you see, where words are quite inadequate to express my meaning. Words, after all, have been evolved to deal with ordinary experience, while this experience was extraordinary, and I make no pretensions to any skill in language. Far more definite than any thought I could formulate was the evidence of my horrified skin, and the feeling of hatred, that, at least, is the right word, which now swept over me. Hatred for the house, the gardens, the presence of Mr. Furnivall himself. All of which, I told myself, was nonsense. In another moment we were talking quite normally and politely about the pains which he had taken to give a feeling of space to the narrow strip of garden which stretched between the house and the road. In this conversation there was nothing sinister. We stood in a little circle, while he spoke with enthusiasm and his own surprising vividness of what he had done. "In my 15 years, he said, "I've changed the whole aspect of the garden, and with my own hands. Great fun it was, too. You see, I took a leaf out of Shenstone's book, the 18th century poet, you know, who used to live under the edge of the hills between here and North Bromwich. He was cramped in the same way, and found it difficult to produce effects of distance. So he planted his avenues as I have done, dark trees, masses of yew and holly and cypress in the foreground, graduating down to pale leaves in the distance. You see? Now, if you'll follow me to the other end," we did so, "you'll see exactly the opposite effect. That brings the house right on top of us. Huh?" It was true. There it stood, with its dark, grimy brick, a steely light reflected from its windows. It seemed to rise up in front of us monstrously, malignantly, as though it hated us. And God knows I hated it too. If this place were mine, I thought. I'd never rest till I got rid of it. I stood there looking at it, so absorbed in hatred that when Furnival took my arm, I felt as if he had guessed my feelings. "But all that's unimportant," he said. "This is what I want to show you. We found it quite by accident when I was digging holes in which to plant the poles of my pergola. At a depth of 3 feet, the poles struck what I thought was rock, 6 of them, one after another, at the same depth. I nearly lost my temper and gave it up. Luckily I didn't. When I dug down to see what it was all about, we struck the pavement. Here it is. You see, I planted the roses all around it, and trained them over to act as a cover." He led the way to a circular pit that I had imagined to be an ornamental tank or fish stew. 3 feet below the surface, as he said, lay a small but perfect square of mosaic. Round the margin a key-fret pattern. In the center a singular medallion, a human figure surrounded by a ring of birds and beasts. "Rough work," he explained. His voice became almost tender as he spoke. "You see, the tesserae are almost all of local material. The red ones are just baked tiles. The chocolate color is the local sandstone. That yellowy white must have been brought here from Cotswolds. It's oolite. As for the figure, it's quite an ordinary one, a reach-me-down, so to speak. Orpheus and the animals. Some of the books try to suggest that this is a Christian motive, symbolized, you know. But that's all my eye. I have evidence to show that the occupants of this villa, or whatever it was, were not Christians. The place, in fact, has never been remarkable for Christianity. Ha! There's a bigger church, I suggested, and Saxon at that. He laughed again. "Quite right," he said. "Quite right. But there's another story. We'll have a look at it later." He left the pavement reluctantly, and held us back for a moment to contemplate the face of the house again. "You've no idea how it grows on one, this building," he said, with an almost pathetic anxiety that we should appreciate it. "The wing on the right—" "That's Tudor," I said. "Pre-Reformation," he corrected me. "What do the names of reigning houses matter? The central fact of English history is the Reformation." He spoke so emphatically that there was nothing more to be said about it. It seemed to annoy him that I didn't take up his challenge, but as I refused to be drawn, he went on talking about the beauties of that horrible house as he saw them. I could see them, too, but they didn't affect my firm conclusion that the place was a bad place and ought to be destroyed. Curiously enough, I felt that he knew this as well as I did, that he wouldn't insist so desperately on its other qualities if he hadn't been aware of this one. So I pulled him up short in the middle of his rhapsody. "Isn't there some story," I said, "about the house being haunted?" His mouth twitched up into the shape of a laugh. "Who told you that?" he said. At that moment my eye caught Mrs. Furnival's. I don't think I've ever seen such a degree of misery in the eyes of a living creature. She stood there, rapt, her hands clasped before her, such white, soft, helpless hands. "Ah, Alma," he went on. "Poor little Alma at the Fox. These people's lives are so empty that they have nothing else to think about." "But it is haunted, isn't it?" said Evelyn timidly. "Don't spoil my illusion by telling me there's nothing in it." "There's enough in it," said Furnival vindictively, "to have turned my poor missus into a papist. That's something, anyway." As he laughed, he looked at the poor woman as though he could kill her. She answered him with a pale, pathetic smile, but the misery was still in her eyes. "Do tell us," said Evelyn persuasively. "I know nothing about it," said Furnival. "I've never seen, felt, or smelt anything at Cold Harbour that wasn't perfectly normal. I can't be more definite than that, can I? Ha?" But Evelyn stuck to her guns. "Perhaps other people," she began. "Other people?" he said. Only a lot of neurotic women and priests. If people are gullible enough to accept a conglomeration of nonsense like the Roman Catholic dogmas, they can accept anything. Don't you agree with me?"
"But if a lot of people have experienced things," Evelyn persisted, "surely there must be something in it. Do tell us. Just one incident."
He smiled at her. In spite of his scathing words, I could guess that where women were concerned he was anxious to please. "Very well," he said, "I'll tell you, but please understand that I take no responsibility. I consider the whole business absolute nonsense. Do you know what a poltergeist is? Of course you don't. They don't exist. But Mrs. Furnival's friends believe in them, and you know what I mean. Well, the fellow we've got here, according to my missus and the priests, is called Jerry. That's our private name for him. The priests love him, and he loves priests. Some years ago we had one of these gentlemen staying here. He belonged to the Church of England, Mrs. Furnival mildly suggested. At the time, yes, said Furnival with a smirk, but Jerry turned him papist too. Well, this poor fellow, his name was Lowe, was positively hag-ridden on his last visit here, if you believe him, that is. Jerry would never let him sleep. One night he went to bed as usual and folded up his clothes on a chair at the foot of the bed. Now, Mrs. Wake, do you know what a man's braces are like? Just where the straps that go on the bottom at the front come off, there's usually a closed metal buckle. Very well. And on a man's drawers, pants is the polite word, there are little loops through which the straps of the braces pass before they button. Now, when Mr. Lowe woke up in the morning, he found that Jerry had run the loop of the pants through the buckle of the braces so that they were fixed like links in a chain. That's a small thing to be frightened of, isn't it? But Mr. Lowe was so upset that he changed his trousers and brought the ones Jerry had tampered with down to breakfast. We all tried to undo the loop. Of course we couldn't. Then my little daughter Elaine said, "Let me have a try," and the thing came adrift in her hands. Oh yes, Mr. Lowe might have had quite a lot of fun with Jerry if he'd had a sense of humor, but he took it all too seriously. Said he'd never stay in the house again, which was no loss to us, and wrote me an insane letter. I've got it still, one of Jerry's best testimonials. He implored me, whatever it might cost and however inconvenient it might be, to leave. What did he say, Jane? A house that was evidently under fire from hostile influences whose power we were unable to measure. Quite in a grand manner, and all that because of a pair of braces. Ha ha! Mrs. Furnival shook her head but did not speak. "And is that really all?" Elaine asked. "Not quite all," said Furnival. "There's another story of a girl who came here as a governess to my children 10 or 12 years ago. She was a methodical creature, who always put her watch on the bedside table when she wound it up at night. And every morning she woke up, she complained that it was moved to some other place. It got on her nerves, poor dear. Well, said I, why the devil don't you put it under your pillow? So she did. Next morning I asked her what had happened. My watch was all right, she said, but the candle that I'd blown out on the bedside table was moved to the top of a high wardrobe. I couldn't reach it, even with a chair. Of course, everyone said, Jerry. We always tried to make a joke of him, said Mrs. Furnival gently, for the children's sake. Exactly, Furnival broke in with some irritation. As you see, it's all so trivial and childish and unimportant that nobody should have made a fuss about it. What happened to the governess? Evelyn asked. She left us. The poor thing couldn't stand it. She left us. The poor thing couldn't stand it. murmured Mrs. Furnivall. And here we are, said Furnivall suddenly, wasting the precious light over superstitious nonsense. Pull yourself together, Jane, and take care of Mrs. Wake while I show the doctor my treasures. We walked up to the house again. I felt like an animal being driven into a butcher's pen. I wondered if Evelyn shared my feelings, and was prepared to refuse to leave her. But when I looked round, I saw the two women following us quite happily, talking in an undertone together. And Mrs. Furnivall had taken her hand, so it seemed all right. As we re-entered the house, a new set of shivers ran up my spine. I determined to fight against it. Jerry, at any rate, I told myself, had nothing to do with that. Indeed, if his were the only sort of possession to which the house was subject, there seemed very little to worry about. So Furnivall himself had suggested, and I, like most medical men whose training has been concentrated on physical signs, was inclined to be skeptical. I don't suppose I should have thought much more about it, if it hadn't been for the exaggerated eagerness with which Furnivall had tried to turn the poor poltergeist to ridicule, combined with the misery that had come into his wife's eyes when the matter was first mentioned. As for my own shivering discomfort, I think I should have put that down to the dampness of Mrs. Higgins's sheets. Furnivall led the way up 2 flights of staircase, 3 wide steps at a time. He was as nimble and full of bursting energy as a boy. Extraordinary for a man of his stature. Then he darted in front of me along a dark passage to the foot of another stairway. "That's the room," he jerked over his shoulder, "where the parson lost his trousers." The walls of the passage were so dark that no door could be seen, and before I could ask him anything more, I stood panting on the landing outside his study. "Isn't this a room now?" he said to me. His eyes positively glistened with pride. "Can you imagine anything better for a man of my tastes? This view over the Black Country, so vast, so sombre. Huh? Isn't it worth 100 sentimental landscapes? Stormy sunsets beyond the Clees, and then, at night, you know, with the furnaces spouting and pit fires smoking, it's like looking down into hell from the battlements of heaven. Quiet, too. No women's voices. Huh?" He swaggered, his hands in his pockets. He was like a boisterous schoolboy. "Doesn't it fit me like a glove?" Then his eyes blazed. "And that's what the missus wants me to leave. I'll see them all damned first. See them damned first," he repeated with a laugh that was like a scream. Then, just as if he were ashamed of showing so much feeling, off he switched into another key, suave, urbane, too polite for words. "Now, Dr. Wake, what can I show you? As you can see, there are plenty of books. In my young days, when I was richer, I was something of a collector. First editions here, manuscripts, and that reminds me, poor Mrs. Wake, who's downstairs being bored by my wife, wanted to see Martocks. Here they are, all the lot of them. A queer devil, Martock. I very nearly saw him die. If I'd stayed another night, I might have had that pleasure. Deathbeds of men of genius. What do they see? Ah? But business, business." I stood there listening to him, turning over the pages of that manuscript that Evelyn would have given her eyes to touch. I didn't read a word of it. I'd seen nothing until he snatched the book out of my hands. "Volumes of art criticism," he went on. "Years of futility. You can't teach men to see beauty. Either the faculty's there or it isn't, and if people haven't got it by birthright, it's no good teaching them to pretend they have. That's what it amounts to. No acquired knowledge is worth a damn. But I suppose stupid people have to acquire it for the purposes of showing off. And how I hate 'em. I wonder if you know a beautiful thing when you see it. Huh?" He thrust a small statuette into my hands, and stood challenging me with a stare, but before I could answer, he'd snatched it away.
Modern, he snapped. Mestrovic. Ancient or modern, beauty is just the same. All through the arts, all through the ages, every one of them. And who'll find the common aestheticness basis? And who'll find the common aesthetic basis? Not me, for one. But I know, Dr. Wake. I know. I can't attempt to keep pace with the spate, the whirlwind of talk that swept over me. I can't do justice, either, to what it contained. I don't suppose, as a matter of fact, that what he said mattered much. It was the man himself. By this time it had begun to rain. A black squall darkened the sky and thrashed the window panes, so that the room grew dim, and in the dimness this extraordinary creature's mind smouldered and glowed and flamed like a furnace. I imagine he didn't often get the chance of flaming before an audience, and now seized his opportunity. When he came close up to me, I could almost feel the palpitating heat of his brain. Amazing. I must have spent at least half an hour there, listening to him and peering at the lovely things he showed me. Greek, Roman, Egyptian. That long, irregular room was more inspiring than any museum, because, he hesitated, because each of its beauties seemed to catch fire from the ardent spirit of its owner. Fire played between them and him as between two magnetic poles. Then, suddenly abandoning his treasures, he began to talk on religion, or rather on comparative religion. In this department his library was enormous, and when he spoke of it, you would have imagined that he had no other interest in life. We spoke of black magic. Now, that's a ticklish subject, he said. If you want to study it, here's your chance. It's played a big part in the history of your learned profession. He showed me 3 shelves crammed with curious books on the subject. I hope you'll approve my arrangement, he said. Witchcraft, psychic, research, and insanity, huh? And from there we drifted away to Mithras and his cult in Roman Britain. I told him that I had seen the Mithraic grottos on Hadrian's Wall. He nodded his head impatiently. Of course, he knew more about them than I did. But talking of the Roman Britons, he said, we've wandered off into so many fascinating byways that we've forgotten all about the things in which you're principally interested. This spring I had a busy time excavating a series of graves placed, as you'd expect them, along the sides of the road where it enters my property. He led me in the dusk, the sky was still dark with the storm, into a large curtained alcove. The whole room was so full of irregularities that I've forgotten its shape. A number of rambling attics of different levels knocked together. In this alcove stood a black oak table like a carpenter's bench, littered with lamps of red pottery, green glass, glazed samian, and little white clay figures. He passed by them all contemptuously. This is all funerary junk, he said. No bones. All the burials were pre-Christian. There's nothing really worth looking at. Nothing, I mean, that you can't see better specimens of in the museums. Of course, for me, it has the sentimental interests of a private discovery, but I don't advise you to waste your time on it. Ah, there's one thing here. He handed me a dagger, heavy but slender, covered with green patina. Bronze, he said. Celtic. Feel the point of it. In spite of 2,000 years, it's still up to its job. I shouldn't like to get that point under the ribs, huh? Of course, I've cleaned it up and shaped it a bit. My sacrificial knife, I call it. That's rot, of course, but all the same, I found it near to this. He pointed to an object which looked to me in the darkness like an oblong chest set up on end and covered with a piece of black velvet. He stood contemplating it with affection. I'll tell you how I got it, he said. Central heating, that's the explanation. Last winter, We had to put down a furnace and boiler underground. The best place for it seemed to be a disused scullery at the old end of the house. There wasn't any cellar beneath it, so we had to dig down under a paved floor. I wasn't expecting anything, but in a place like this one has always to be on the lookout. And this is what we found. Nothing else. With a gesture that was almost theatrical, he swept off the black velvet cover and lit a candle that stood on the end of the bench. Then he stood waiting for me to catch the fire of his controlled enthusiasm. "It looks to me like a votive altar," I said. "And that's what it is," he laughed. "Rough work, the local Permian sandstone, badly used by weather. No decoration, only the plain inscription. Can you read it?" "No, the light's too bad, but that doesn't matter. It's Greek. I'll translate. 'Thou seest me, an altar of Astarte, Gaius, Consturion of the 20th Legion, Valeria, Victorix, set me up.' What do you make of that?" His laugh was so shrill as to be positively embarrassing. I felt that anything I might say in reply would be feeble and inadequate. "It's remarkably interesting." "Interesting!" he screamed. "I should just think it was. Do you realize that there's only one other altar to Astarte in Britain, at Cambridge on the wall? But that's nothing. Who the hell was Gaius? And what was the 20th Legion doing here?" I pulled my wits together. The 20th Legion, I told him, was stationed at Chester. Its badge, a charging boar, was often seen on monuments there. "Quite right," said he. "The 20th was at Diva, but the Cold Harbour tombstones all relate to the 14th. Now I'll tell you something. When Suetonius went east to deal with the lady whom the English persist in calling Boadicea, he reinforced the 14th Legion, of which we have evidence on this spot, with the vexillatio, shock troops, of the 20th. And when the lady Boadicea, as I called her, had been dealt with, the centurion Gaius must have been left here with the legionary detachment to which he'd been seconded. And here he set up his altar to Astarte, the goddess of the groves. Now do you see light? Huh?" He rubbed his hands in ecstasy. "Remember the name of the place? Cold Harbour? The colony of trees? Why not the colony of the grove? Have you seen the great circles of the beeches that surround the house?" He rubbed his hands in ecstasy. "Remember the name of the place? Cold Harbour? The colony of trees? Why not the colony of the grove? Have you seen the great circles of beeches that surround the house? I don't suggest that the beeches are Roman, but what I do believe is that they have replaced, or their ancestors replaced, a circle deliberately planted by this Gaius. That this is the one place in Britain, apart from that isolated fort on the wall, in which the Syrian mysteries were celebrated." "It's a pretty theory," I admitted, rather grudgingly. "Theory?" he snorted. "I tell you it's a fact. I know." He made the whole thing so dramatic that I couldn't help smiling. "No doubt," I said, "your library in black magic has enabled you to obtain an interview with the centurion, or perhaps with Astarte herself." With him it was no joking matter. He said nothing, but glared at me with the same look of insane hatred that I had already intercepted on its way to Mrs. Furnivall in the garden. I assure you it was most uncomfortable. I didn't know for a moment what would be the end of it. Then suddenly his mouth twitched up into another laugh. "Let's go downstairs," he said, "and see what the women are doing. What about a whiskey and soda before tea?" I refused as politely as I could, but that didn't prevent him from mixing a stiff drink for himself. On the landing, it seemed to me that I heard Evelyn's voice, but there was no sound of footsteps and nothing to be seen, and so we moved down the stairs in silence, returning to the room in which he had received us. From the moment we had left Furnival's study, neither of us had spoken, and now it seemed as if this strange silence must continue. Furnival himself stood with his legs wide apart in front of the fire, a sturdy, prepotent figure, and I, without knowing what I did, found myself standing in front of a sort of lectern, on which the beautifully printed 17th century Bible lay open before me. I don't know how it was, but as I turned the pages, my eyes fell upon a single verse that seemed to detach itself from the rest and force itself to my attention. I can't tell you to which of the books of the Bible it belongs, and at that moment I can't even be certain of quoting it accurately. But this is, more or less, what I found myself reading. "There shall not be found in any one among you that useth divination, or an observer of the times, or an enchanter, or a charmer, or a consulter with familiar spirits, or a necromancer. For all that do these things are an abomination unto the Lord." And as I read these words, I find it quite impossible to express the feeling exactly. It seemed as if all the influence that had shivered my skin to goose-flesh rushed upward into my brain, so that I lost consciousness of every blessed thing but an overpowering murderous desire to destroy Furnival as he stood there toasting his calves. Before that I'd been puzzled by him. If I disliked him, the dislike had been quite indefinite, but now my whole brain seemed to be swept up in a positive conflagration of hate. I looked up from my book. Our eyes met. He answered with a normal, innocent smile, but that made no difference. Once or twice during the war I caught myself seeing red, but nothing like that. God only knows what would have happened if at that very instant Evelyn and Mrs. Furnival hadn't entered the room. And I think that's a good place to stop. I may have made a few errors, but sometimes it wasn't my fault. There was very definitely an open quotation marks left out. I won't bother to show you, just take my word for it. Interesting story. Heavy descriptions and slower pacing than we can expect from 1920s novel. But interesting, I have to say. Yeah, it always makes me curious. So where exactly is this going with different elements? But hey, Dragon of the West, thank you for the lurk. Oh, and an evil bot. Is it even worth banning them at this point? I do like horror series niftiness. There's Hammer House of Horrors, the TV show. Yes, I'm familiar with Hammer's movies, and I've heard of Hammer's House of Horrors. Are there some really good episodes in that? I expect there would be, and good actors too. And Moosey Fade, welcome in, and Captain Thaco. Hey, great to see you guys. Oh, thanks, niftiness. Yeah, that was a long section, like I said. Long chapters. I try to keep the audiobook streams shorter, Maybe an hour and 15 minutes of concerted reading. I feel like, have I seen something from Hammer's House of Horror? I just heard of it. I'll have to look that up. Thank you for the suggestion, niftiness. There's more Hammer movies I need to see, too. Been meaning to get around to the Gorgon for years. Reptile. The Reptile was an extremely good one. Yeah. But I should probably wrap up for the night. Grab some dinner. But I'll check who's online, see where we're going to raid, and then
Tell me what's coming up on stream. Oh. Oh, we never get. Hey, I'm forgetting how much she's grown. She doesn't need us to raid her. Did we raid Rush Pirate the other night? Oh, let me see if. I haven't raided the analog man in a bit. Yeah, he's just starting out. Don't know what retro he's playing. Oh, my pleasure, Captain Thaco. Captain of Curiosities. Oh, I've never heard of that one. I do like a good horror anthology. Seems like that would be a fun type of series to write. Oh, thank you, Niftiness. So, what's coming up on the stream? Well, Wednesday. I guess the simplest thing is to continue Resident Evil 3 on Wednesday. You can finally get through that nasty boss fight with Mr. Star's killer. And Saturday, alright, I'll find some Halloween themed game for a short horror Saturday. And Sunday, I don't know, I kind of think I'm not going to. I mean, maybe I'll put in a couple more hours trying to get Alone in the Dark New Nightmare to capture, but God, I put in so many and it's such a damn pain. So maybe I'll start some other horror game for Spooktober, probably an adventure. Some I've been meaning to play for a bit, like an English Haunting, Harvester, Shivers. I don't know. I'll just spend hours and hours trying to decide. Oh, and I did hear back from the developer of, what's it called? Nameless Inheritance. I posted on the page asking if there were walkthroughs or hints. He offered to try and give me hints, so I was thoroughly stuck in that, but I will continue that at some point. Fun stuff coming up. Oh, I mean, I know I'm able to run New Nightmare in windowed mode through DxWind, and I think I'm also able to trigger it using a command line argument through the exe. I mostly use, but even though it's technically running in windowed mode, like it thinks it's in full screen mode, and then if you alt tab, and it always captures your mouse. I can't seem to get DxWind to release it. And so then if you alt tab out of it, then it thinks it's in full screen mode. It'll be like, oh, you're not focused on the game, I should pause the game. And that's, I think, where the difficulty is in capturing it. And also, even though it's technically in a window, OBS thinks it's in full screen. And so you can't capture it through window capture, which I've never seen before. Oh, and the game also disables your Windows key. Like, who did that back in, like, 2001? No. You've had the same issue? Now, if you can think of a way that I might be able to capture this, yeah, please do send me a message, Niftiness. I have to look into that more. And I should raid out and get dinner. Ooh, you had a problematic game too, Moosey Fate. If it weren't so late, I would stick around and solicit more of you all's advice now, but I hope I can pick your brains or hear suggestions at a later point. Yeah, some games just straight up never will work. Like, they're games I've given up on. Every compatibility mode one by one. Oh, just through like Windows compatibility. Did I? You know, man, I don't know if I did that last year, but I don't think I did this year. I would have had the same settings I was using last year when I somehow got it captured. Maybe I'll worry about it tomorrow. My brain's not drooping. Thank you guys. Good to see you, Dragon and Niftiness and Moosey Fate. And I appreciate all the chatters and all the lurkers. And everybody who came to enjoy good horror audiobook. And you guys can find me on Twitter and MySpace, where I post stream announcements, polls, and random nonsense. And you can find VODs of my past streams up on YouTube. And I do have a channel in the Retroactive Discord server, for all I use it. So I hope that everybody has a good night, dreams of the cold harbor in the Black Country, and Roman legions and poltergeists. Say hi to the analog man, and I'll see you guys on Wednesday.